I am here today with the SP-404 Mark II with update 4.04. See what they did there? Roland has fiercely been coming up with updates for the SP-404 Mark II since its release, and I see what they're doing. It seems that with each update, they're trying to reach a larger and larger audience with the Mark II, and simultaneously just making the unit better for everybody involved. As I'm sure a lot of you know, I've been a big advocate for the SP-404 Mark II since its release, and now given the experience that I have with other electronic music gear, I could see the light. In the sense that I could see how the SP-404 Mark II can replace certain aspects, or is at least comparable to lots of other current gear that's on the market today, especially after the latest update 4.04, and so that's what this entire video is about. Honestly, from what I've seen, most people are still not fully aware of what the SP-404 Mark II is capable of. We've of course moved way past it just being like a lo-fi hip-hop sampler, and I think that the timing is right here. This is a relevant and real discussion to bring up here in the online YouTube synth sampler gear community. What can the 404 Mark II replace at this point? This is my take. Of course, anyone you hear on the internet, just take their experience with a grain of salt, but yeah, this is what I have to say. I always like to mention this up front. Your support is greatly appreciated. It's very helpful. Watching this video is enough. Of course, liking and subscribing helps the channel a lot. If this or any of my other videos are like the tipping point, the reason that you would get into a specific piece of gear, please use the affiliate links that are in the description of this video or any of my other videos as well. I make a small commission from that sale. It doesn't cost you anything extra. This is an independent YouTube channel and you're the ones that keep it going, so any help and support is greatly appreciated. Thank you. There's also a lot of information here, so if you're looking to jump to something specific, of course you could use the timestamps or chapters that are linked in the description of this video. Let's get comparing what can the SP-404 Mark II replace after update 4.04 and reasons why. The SP-404 Mark II versus MPC-1. After this update, the MPC-1 is the first thing that came to mind in terms of it sort of creeping up on. First off, I have an in-depth comparison between these two from a while back after the first update, or maybe the first or second update of the Mark II. Audio exporting options were always superior on the MPC-1 because you're able to export individual pads to stems and then maybe drop that into your DAW, work with it as you'd like. Okay, well, after this latest update, you could do the exact same thing with the SP-404 Mark II. It's a very easy process through the computer app. So the same workflow, and on top of this, you're able to merge up to 4 samples on any given pads onto one pad. You're also now able to bounce down pattern chains into a single audio file. If you're an OG 404 user like the 404SX and you have a bunch of clutch projects on there, the update allows the projects to be converted directly on the SP-404 Mark II hardware. So in previous versions, you would have had to use the app for that. To me personally, I find that this audio flexibility is like the most important part of this update, and it's really the thing that brings it closer to the MPC. It also just brings up the general flexibility and value of the unit, but without it being like a straight up DAW in a box like this workflow. Another major advantage here is that a few updates back, they implemented the ability to control MIDI effects through an external controller. And here's a video on that if you'd like to dig deeper into the topic. Essentially, instead of having to menu dive between all of your effects, you could just have them all in one spot on an external MIDI controller. And also, to be clear, that's including the 2 master effects buses. So you have like your performance effects buses right here that you could jump back and forth from. If you go into EFX settings, you could see that there's actually 2 extra buses here as well. So bus 3, bus 4, and you could choose whatever effects you want there. So that is all MIDI assignable. In my experience, the MPC-1 is great at controlling other things. It's good at being like the master controller. As soon as you want to control it in any sort of sophisticated way, it just will not cooperate. Whereas the 404 is good at both. Also portability factor, like this is battery powered if you want it to be. It's also just smaller than the MPC-1. If you're someone who's trying to get away from that DAW workflow, you're not going to want essentially a DAW in a box. It's really powerful, but it is a DAW, in which case the 404 Mark II sweeps in and might be right up your alley. Some of you might think that this comparison is a bit of a stretch, but there's always been some overlap between the 404 Mark II and the OP1 or the OP1 Field. Obviously, besides the giant price difference, they're from the same era, essentially. Like the OG OP1 came out around the same time as the SX, I'm pretty sure, and these were released at a similar time as well, maybe like a year or so apart. Obviously, both are extremely portable units, and they're both pretty much at the top in terms of popularity for desktop gear these days. And I would say like for the past decade or so. I love the OP1 Field, but at this point, the Mark II just offers so much more at about a third of the price. It's a much more practical unit. It's a much stronger sequencer and sampler. It's a lot more useful in combination with other gear. Obviously, the OP1 wins with synth sounds for sure. But I mean, that's not really the essence of what the 404 is. Although they did just lay down the beginning stages, there's actually a sound generator in the Mark II now. So it's beginning to venture into that synth territory. The thing that I always loved about the OP1 is this sort of spontaneous on-the-fly beat composition tool. It's like a sketch pad, sort of. A very limited sketch pad. I would basically just treat it as an idea starter, or I've just used it straight up for its synth sounds. And while the 404 Mark II is becoming less and less limited, I mean, all hardware has its limits, of course, but I found that once you get used to the workflow of the 404, you could treat it in that sort of spontaneous sketchpad idea starter sort of way. And again, now that you're able to bounce those ideas that may be on individual pads out to stems, it gives you that same flexibility to just drop things into your DAW and dress them up in that way. So while the OP1's workflow in itself is extremely limited, at least you're able to bounce individual tracks to stems. And of course, if this is a workflow that you're looking for and you don't want to drop like $2,000 on the OP1 Field, then maybe the SP-404 Mark II is right for you. The 404 Mark II versus Ableton as a live performance tool. So we've discussed this as a composition tool. You could of course perform whatever it is that you compose within the unit as well, pretty easily. But what if we inverted the roles here and maybe wanted to compose something that we're really comfortable with, like a DAW, like Ableton or something like that, and then drop those stems into the 404 Mark II to perform with? You can absolutely do this. In fact, I did a whole video on this with my buddy Dustin, who is a product manager at Roland. To sort of sum up that video, of course, I'm not going to sit here and say that the SP-404 Mark II is a more powerful performance tool than Ableton Live, because it's not. But it's a different, more portable and more condensed, more limited workflow, which is great for spawning creativity, those sorts of limits. For me, there's like a limit sweet spot. So something like the OP1, as I said before, it's like so limited. Whereas this, it's getting more towards just the right amount of limitedness. And what I'm about to mention is actually not even part of the 4.04 update. It was in a previous update that they added this. There's a new function called one-shot gate mode. If you have samples of different bar lengths, they could be looping over top of one another simultaneously without getting cut off by the length of your TR rec sequence. So for example, if you have a pattern that's 1 bar long specifically for drums, which is pretty common for many different styles of dance music like techno, house music, you can use that 1 bar sequence to very quickly on the fly add drums or take out drums, add little drum fills, while your longer one-shot gate mode samples will play simultaneously over top of that, and they'll just keep looping. In this case, your patterns in your pattern sequencer essentially act as scenes in Ableton Live. It's like a very similar sort of approach, just a different layout. Of course, all the while having full access to dozens of multi-effects to perform live with. As I mentioned earlier, if that's routed to a small MIDI controller, you have access to all of this on the fly during a performance. So it's a pretty wicked performance tool. So all of that is something to consider. I'm considering it at this point to put together a set with this thing. A techno set. SP-404 Mark II versus the SP-555 or the Boss Looper. For me at this point, this is not a workflow that I'm super accustomed to, but it's one of the biggest parts of update 4.04, so I feel like I have to mention it in this video. It seems like more of a record a live instrument thing into loops, as opposed to something that I could use for electronic music, which is already so loop based to begin with. So yeah, it's more of a live looper. And going back to the point about opening up the 404 Mark II to a new audience with each update, in this case, this is actually probably the biggest part of the update. It definitely opens up the unit to people who are more in that like one-man band, singer, songwritery sort of thing, maybe. This part of the update is a tribute to the SP-404, which is capable of this sort of workflow, so they just added it in. This also reminds me of the Boss Looper, which is a similar type of workflow, and once again, I see a lot of singer songwriters using that. The Mark II versus Koala sampler, although it's not really a versus, it's actually a team up. This is another thing that, again, I am not familiar with at all. I do not know anything about Koala sampler, but it's another big part of the update, so I feel like I have to mention it. So for those of you who don't know, after update 4.04, the Mark II is now compatible with Koala sampler, which is a music making software sampling application, which you could use like on your phone or on an iPad or something like that. As you probably already know, especially if you watch this channel, the Mark II has a DJ mode. Here is an extensive video on that. Again, much like with Ableton, I'm not going to suggest that the 404 Mark II is just going to replace your entire vinyl DJ setup or something like that. But with a small MIDI controller, again, controlling multi-effects, you could do a lot with 2 tracks and a bunch of effects. On top of this, if you'd like to maybe play drums or your own melodic parts over top of what's going on in DJ mode, you're able to do that. You could actually sync a unit to the tempo of whatever track you're DJing. It actually works really well. Here's a clip. They're taking a step in the right direction, I think, with DJ mode. Bear with me here, the SP-404 Mark II versus the Octatrack. I know this is like an extremely bold comparison to make, but wait a minute. I'm definitely not going to be comparing workflows because they are so different. I mean, the Octatrack is like 13 years old now. It's still an absolute beast. The relevance of this part of the comparison is that they're both very beastly. They're both capable of doing many things. Especially after update 4.04, there are so many different ways that you could use the Mark II. Sampler, sequencer, DJ mode, now a live looper, maybe just an end of chain effects mixer. It's happy to control other units or be controlled. It cooperates both ways. Maybe a basic or more limited replacement of Ableton Live. Now it's got a basic sound generator as well. Or you could use it as a hybrid combination of all the things that I just mentioned. It's the type of situation that depending on your workflow, where you're coming from, you could choose the way that you want to use it. The Octatrack obviously has that same sort of effect. It's extremely powerful. I see people using it mostly as like an effects mixer, a live effects mixer, or as a sequencer. I know that this is apples and oranges. I'm not making a hardcore comparison here, but I think you see what I mean. But I will say, especially after update 4.04, there is a major advantage here. The Octatrack is about 13 years old now, and while it's being rediscovered because of how beastly it is, it's old. Like, this is old technology. In my opinion, it's at the end of its reign in terms of compatibility with future software, because you can only push it so far, right? The 404 Mark II, on the other hand, it's new technology. They just keep updating it. They keep pushing its limits. Every update that they've done, it's really increasing the value of the unit without it actually getting more expensive. So it's just a great deal now. As a result, the technology is just a lot more modern. It's a bit more integrated with today's technology. A perfect example of this is obviously Koala sampler. It's kind of like the way of the future for a lot of artists, producers. And in my opinion, that's just kind of how things go in this capitalistic society. Things move forward, technology advances, older technology becomes obsolete. I mean, think about the iPhone 6 versus the iPhone 13. It's like ancient. And I think that it's a similar thing with music tech, with all tech pretty much. That's what I have for you guys today. Hopefully I didn't offend any of you with this comparison. It's all in good fun. Thank you guys so much for being here. There are affiliate links for all of the gear mentioned in this video. I also have a Patreon where I've started to include extended versions of all of my videos. So if you'd like to see that, go check it out. A bunch of other exclusive content there as well. All right, see you soon.